good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning to everyone. And let me start with a little bit of a preamble to say thank you to Dagmar for taking the initiative and working with Shell and working across many of you and the Shell alumni for creating this ability to bond, to engage, or to re-engage, and to stay engaged. I think we shared something in common for a long time at Shell. Some of us for our whole career, some of us for a portion of our career. But what we shared in a bond, I think, is a trust in the values that we all proclaimed: honesty, integrity, respect for people. I can't tell you how many times in my post Shell career I've been reminded of what a comfort those values were. And while an imperfect, perhaps, implementation of those values at times, by and large, people who succeeded in Shell, I think, reflected to the greatest extent they could what those values meant to them, and from whatever geographical or uh, regional part of the world they came from. And to me, that was always a uniting factor. Let me also congratulate every one of you for making the brave decision to become an alumnus of Shell or an alumna of Shell. It's not easy to step away from that security, that safety, that purpose, that intent, that meaningful work that we were each doing in our own way, and the people, of course, we were associated with. It's a hard thing to do. And if you've done it voluntarily, or you've done it because it's your time to go and your employment contract said at such and such an age, it's time for us to say goodbye, it's still a courageous decision. And one taken, I think, after significant thought and worry and planning. And I think that all bodes well for the future, because we each come from such a great, I would say, wealth of experience and wealth of relationship capability and a great amount of capacity. The capacity of people at Shell, as I think we all know, is truly exceptional. And we don't lose that capacity just because we don't call ourselves Shell actives anymore. We carry that capacity into the future, whatever work we choose to do or whatever activities we choose to do. And then I think finally, I would say in the preamble, we can say to everyone we meet in the future that we were there. We were there and we were contributing to the beginnings of the great energy transition of the 21st century. We inherited an incredible energy system and an incredible capability to make good things happen in the world because of molecules and electrons. But we were also there as the transition began, as we started to make up for the climate impacts of what we had done in the previous century. And so I find great satisfaction in saying, yes, we were part of it. I recall, as you may know, I was not a lifetime Shell person. I came in 1997 at the age of 50. And in the first month that I was there, second month maybe, we announced the first announcement of our embracing of the renewables business. And at that time, it was hydrogen, it was solar, it was wind, and it was forestry. And we were going to put $2 billion into those businesses to begin to express our intent and the direction of the company in terms of energy for the future. As well as, of course, we were investing at the time about 14, $15 billion in traditional business. But over the years, I can't be prouder of what I experienced up through today, of how I think Shell has taken a leadership position on energy for the future. And I think that's a wonderful heritage that we all share and we all carry with us. So this is about what have I been doing since I retired. I left in end of June 2008, which is now more than 12 years ago. And I had a whole new career lined up for me myself. Uh, since I knew my end date was certain because my contract was very clear, about a year and a half ahead of time, my wife and I talked extensively about what's next. Because for both of us, we felt much younger than our age at the time. We had a great platform of the Shell Oil Company to spring from. It was a time of turmoil in the US because 2008, if you recall, was the impact of the Great Recession. And at the same time we had the Great Recession, two things were happening in the energy space. One, enormous price increases for a gallon of gasoline. And for those of you not familiar with the United States, the price of gas is a major determinant of the happiness level of Americans. It just is built into our DNA that the price of gas makes a difference. Political careers are made or lost over the price of gasoline in the United States. And we were, in some places in the US, pushing past $5 a gallon, which for the US was just unacceptable, unbearable in terms of our lifestyle. And the second thing that was happening was the Great Recession, along with a presidential campaign and election in 2008. So I felt leaving Shell and jumping into that environment, what do I do? And I chose to do three things really. One, build upon an effort that was going on within the oil and gas industry, in large measure led by Shell, to communicate directly with the public about the future of energy. And so I created a small not-for-profit company called Citizens for Affordable Energy. On July 1st, 2008, we put the papers in for Citizens for Affordable Energy. And it's called a 501c3, which means it's not for profit and it is not a political lobbying organization. It is, by definition, a charitable NGO. And the purpose of Citizens for Affordable Energy was to extend the opportunity to teach everyday Americans or to engage everyday Americans on how energy impacts their lives and how critical it is to get the future of energy correct from an energy supply standpoint, from an energy efficiency standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, and from an environmental remediation and environmental protection standpoint. Those four pillars were really the basis on which we wanted to engage Americans at every level of society, from the well-to-do and the powerful to the people who really just put gasoline in their car or had natural gas heating their homes or electricity from whatever source from their electricity provider. But everybody had a stake in it. So my first priority was to get that started and to create an all-volunteer organization, no staff, no salaries, no assets, just a virtual organization that would build support from all levels of society across the country. And at our peak, we had several hundred people across the US who were helping to carry the message out. We called them ambassadors. And they weren't paid, they just did it because they thought it was the right thing to do. The second was to try to put myself forward for academic work. I've always had a great love of universities. One of the privileges I had at Shell was to have relationships with universities in Europe, in Asia, and of course in North America, and to somehow connect with a school or two where perhaps I could play a role one way or another, even teach. And so as it turned out, I ended up with three teaching positions, one at Arizona State University, one at Kansas State University, where I was an alum, and third at the University of Houston. And so that was the second aspect of what I wanted to do, was to connect with the university to put forward more ideas and affect the young people coming through those universities on the future of energy, the energy transition, we now call it. In those days, 12 years ago, we called it the future of energy. And thirdly, because I developed a bit of a reputation for being outspoken on energy matters and had a somewhat of a public platform as the Shell country chair in the US, and having done a fair amount of broadcast news on all the major networks and the major cable stations while still at Shell as the Shell Oil president, I carried that forward. And I wanted to have a public persona in the policy-making circles of state governments or the national government in Washington, D.C. And so my third activity was to stay public and to stay outspoken. And in order to support that activity, I wrote a book. And I wrote a book called Why We Hate the Oil Companies. Because as we went through the period of 2005, 6, and 7, with the constant rise in the gasoline price, the hostility towards the oil companies in the US was reaching an all-time high. Americans, as I said, don't like $4, $5 gasoline. And so they blame the oil companies because, as we all know, with a high crude oil price, integrated major oil companies do produce a lot of revenue and a lot of gross profit and a lot of net profit. And so here we are as a major integrated company making all this money while Americans are paying $4 or $5 a gallon. So the hostility was huge. And to write a book about my experience in the industry with what I felt was working and what was not working with the energy industry broadly in the US, I made it generic. It was not a book about Shell. In fact, I got a call from a person in Shell in the legal department saying, before your book is published, we need to see it, because they wanted to check and see is this a tell-all book on Shell? And it was not. It was a book that I frankly dedicated to my colleagues at Shell and honored them in the book. Shell was the platform of experience from which I could write, but the book sold pretty well, actually. Not that you make a lot of money off of a book, but what you do get is a lot of attention. Ironically, and this was, as you know, completely unplanned, 2 weeks after my book was launched, the BP Macondo disaster occurred. And so my book was launched very early in April, and late April, we had the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, which nearly destroyed BP. When the Macondo well blew out and the platform caught fire, the Deepwater Horizon platform caught fire, and people died, and people jumped off that platform to save their lives in the dark of night. And then the oil started seeping out of the well, not actually seeping, it was blowing out of the well, pouring out of the well. And for month after month after month, we saw the efforts to contain the oil spill on the Gulf of Mexico. The President of the United States and the First Lady went to the Alabama beach to spend a weekend to say, yes, the beach is still open. But Michelle Obama wore a white dress stained with black to demonstrate the oil on the beach. And so we had this enormous hostility coming towards the oil companies. And so the book, Why We Hate the Oil Companies, is I had a lot of fun writing it, and then a lot of fun public speaking, because I had, frankly, and I don't say this to boast, I had thousands of invitations to come speak about the nature of the book. And so for the next 3 to 4 years after the book was published, in addition to a lot of television, I did a lot of public speaking, everything from church sanctuaries to a 17,000 person crowd in Lafayette, Louisiana, in the Louisiana Dome there in Lafayette. When Obama shut down the Gulf of Mexico, if you recall, after the Macondo well, the president withdrew all the permits to operate on every platform in the Gulf of Mexico, so that in the political response to the BP Macondo, it was a very, very tough period for the industry. But for me personally, it was a bountiful opportunity to go speak about what I care about so much, which is, of course, the future of energy. So I would say that, if I could, in summary, say that everything I put into my post-Shell career was to become something of a subject matter expert on the energy transition. And in order to do that, I had to do one more thing. I had to learn about the power business, because within the Shell context, it's not really in the mainstream of what Shell does, the power business. Certainly, Shell provides the molecules to the power business, but the power business itself is very separate and different. So I had to get comfortable with power ranging from nuclear, all the sources of energy, all the renewable energies, all of the traditional fossil energies, coal included, along with nuclear and geothermal and hydrogen and so the 10 major sources. So it was a period of study, a period of writing, a period of engaging, and frankly, I haven't had a day off since I left Shell. It's, I say that somewhat literally, because my wife and I have not really taken a holiday trip. By choice, because frankly, with the engagement that I was doing before the COVID-19 hit, I was still traveling 70% of the time. And my base is in Houston, Texas, but frankly, all over the world. Remarks in Beijing, remarks in Singapore, remarks in India, and of course Africa several times, but primarily in the U.S. Some in Europe, but primarily in the U.S. One other thing that happened that came along is invitations to be on the boards of different companies. And so I've served on about 5 different publicly listed company boards. I've timed out on a couple where after 10 years, it's time to go. So I've been in the oil field services sector of the industry. I'm also now in the test, inspection, and certification portion of the business of the industry with a company called A Plus, based in Madrid. And more recently, I've joined a board where the company is headquartered in Sydney, Australia, but its single asset is a lithium boron mine based in Nevada in the US. And so we are developing a project to become the North American largest supplier of lithium to the battery electric car business looking forward, and the battery storage for utilities. And we've had people from Tesla as well as other companies come look at our mine, and it's a major asset. It's got probably a 30 to 60 year life, depending upon assets in part of the acreage that we haven't fully probed yet, but it's a very rich resource. And so the service on the publicly held company boards is an activity that I enjoy as well. So I would say that if I wrap it all up, it's been enjoyable. I've probably missed Shell every day of my life, but I expected that. It's sort of like California. If you ever live in California, you will miss it forever. You're probably glad you're not there because it's so expensive, but it is such a wonderful place in many respects that you miss California every day you're not there. I miss Shell every day I'm not there. But I'm not looking backward. I'm really looking forward, which I hope that is what all of Shell alumni do, is look forward. Look back for the good times and the reminiscence and the memories. And I see John Ritko is with us today. And John, I can't tell you how many Broadwater stories I have told on the East Coast. And John was the manager of an effort by Shell in the gas and power business to set up a liquefied natural gas regasification facility on Long Island, New York. And he won the support of Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg, very big names in American politics. But we stumbled with the governor of New York, who was really a piece of work. And ultimately, in the end, we couldn't get the license from the governor of New York to build the project. But John did an incredible job of making friends in the metropolitan area of New York City. for a number of years until we had to pull the plug on the project. All of that was pre-fracking. The idea of when Jeroen van der Veer asked me to take over the U.S. job of country chair and president Shell Oil Company, he said, John, one of the most critical things you must do. We have 5 LNG regasification projects that we want to put in the U.S. from the Gulf of Mexico to the southern coast of the U.S. to the middle Atlantic and to the Northeast. And if there's one thing I need for you to do, for me, for Shell shareholders, get at least 3 out of those 5 projects up and running and make them happen. That, of course, was 2005. How the world has changed in the U.S. with the shale revolution that's occurred here. And now Shell is, not just Shell, but the U.S. is exporting oil, exporting LNG like there's no tomorrow. And it's made a huge difference in the energy future of this country. Amazingly, for being the world's largest economy, we're having a president who walked away from the Paris Accord, which, by the way, I thought was an incredible achievement. The U.S. has reduced its greenhouse gas pollution more than any other country in the world because of natural gas, because of the transition from coal, where when I became president of Shell Oil Company, more than half of all the electricity in the nation came from coal. Today, coal is just about 20% of the electricity production in the U.S., maybe 23%. That's a tremendous change, all primarily thanks to natural gas. Some from wind and solar, but primarily natural gas has taken over. And nuclear has been shrinking slightly because of the aging of the nuclear plants in the U.S. system. But natural gas has just blossomed. And the exporting of LNG will be a big factor in the future as well. So it's been a dynamic 12 years. As I said, I miss Shell every day. But at the same time, for any of us with the platform that we once had, to be able to speak to the energy transition that's going on worldwide is, I think, a very impactful and a very important part of what we as alumni can do, whether it's in our neighborhoods or with our families, because I think there is a rational way forward that will address the climate. I just can't say enough good things about Shell's Sky scenario. It's Jeremy did a great job on this, has done a wonderful job for years on Shell scenarios, oceans and mountains, and now Sky. And if you haven't seen them, do go to the website, RDS website. It's a fantastic read, whether it's oceans, mountains, or sky. You really get a sense of people who know what they're doing and who have set a course to go make it happen. And I think from everything I read or see, and I don't have any direct information source other than the website, it just seems to be a tremendously credible story about where we go from here and what good that does for the environment and global warming and climate change and all the associated, and at the same time, producing the energy needed to eliminate poverty. That's one of the great accidental happenings of the last decade is I got connected to a United Nations Sustainable Development Project, which was just through connections, just through friends of friends. And I got appointed to a committee that was looking at once a year, $1 million award, prize award to a developing world company that was impacting the future of the energy system or the climate or the environment in that country. And for 3 years running, we gave awards until our funding source went away to some incredible companies, little companies, 20 people in the company, whether it was in Bangladesh or whether it was in Zimbabwe, some incredible stuff going on. But in lands of dire poverty, it's hard for us as Shell people to really understand how drastically dire poverty is, and to witness it and to see it and to realize that without energy, that poverty will continue. So the fact that we can conceivably eliminate poverty worldwide with molecules and electrons, and at the same time clean up the environment and remediate to net negative carbon, ultimately, as the Shell Sky scenario points out, it's a remarkable journey that we're on. So let me close it there, Dagmar. If that gives a sense of purpose, a sense of well-being, I'd share that with you. And I'm happy to, engage in conversation, discussion, questions you may have. And let me hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, John. And I'm sure there's several questions. So I see that on the chat, David Purvis has provided one question. So let's start with your question, David. Maybe you want to just articulate it yourself, and anyone else, you just basically, you don't need to necessarily put it into the chat. You can just, because this is a small enough group to oversee it a little bit, come in once a question has been answered. So David, over to you.
John, thanks for sharing this morning. My question was, in your university courses, what were or are the key learnings from your Shell tenure that you share with your students?
I try to get them to understand that energy is about more than supply. Most of us talk about supply, we talk about sources, but energy is so much more. In fact, I describe the integrated oil companies with stories from Shell and Exxon and Chevron and so forth as technology companies, and really try to help them understand that the technology of oil and gas is very similar to the technology of aerospace. That is, we're up against the laws of science and physics all the time. We're trying to master knowledge and master applications utilizing technology in places where no one has ever been, and to do things, whether it's chemical engineering, whether it's material science, whether it's the application of heat, pressure, whatever, for the cracking of molecules, but or searching below the earth. And I try to share with them the incredible stories of the technologies of deep water, or the technologies of the horizontal drilling. And how in the world do you get a 90-degree turn in steel pipe miles under the earth? And I try to boggle their minds with the advances in technology, which ultimately comes to them silently as electrons they can't see, or molecules that they don't understand what it does in an internal combustion engine, or a gas furnace, or whatever it may be. And so, and also to talk about the breadth of the industry in terms of what I mentioned earlier is efficiency, infrastructure, environmental impact. And it just blows their minds when I do this with the media also all the time, that the best environmental science that we have on this earth comes from people like oil and gas companies. And it just blows their mind when I say something like that, because they just can't. What do you mean, best environmental science? And I said, these are, it has to be done as a reality. It's an everyday life or death matter in the oil business. And you protect people's lives every day. And you protect the community in which you're operating. And yes, horrible things can happen, but that's not what's the intent. That's the intent, is to keep it all a closed system. And the other thing I try to do is help them understand energy density as a part of learning about energy. Because the naivete, usually on the first day of class, and I've had now, over 10 years of students, and I teach 3 classes a semester, although I took this semester off because of the COVID. So I've had hundreds and hundreds of students. On the first day of class, everybody is wind and solar. Yes, wind and solar, wind and solar. And then I start to explain density. And the way I define energy density for the students is the difference between having a pint of Haagen-Dazs 4% buttermilk or butterfat ice cream, your favorite flavor, and having a Kool-Aid popsicle, just water, flavored water, and frozen in the freezer with a little sugar in it. Except take the sugar out, because the density difference between the butterfat ice cream and the popsicle, there's no room. When you compare it with oil and gas versus wind and solar, there's just no comparison in density terms. And there's a famous, quite famous, maybe you've heard of him, Vaclav Smil, a professor at the University of Manitoba. Vaclav Smil is probably the best author, most prolific author of talking about energy and energy's future. And I rely on him to help me explain what energy density is all about and what it means. And he's just brilliant in his analyses of energy density, so that they understand when they're advocates of wind and solar, that's fine. But between the energy density and the power density, how can you possibly afford wind and solar to displace all of this very dense energy that comes from oil and gas and coal and nuclear? And how do we make the different trade-offs? So I would say that the students, I try not to be too technical and try to use a lot of stories, because energy can easily be described in storytelling about the good things that happen, the not so good things that happen. And then so at one of the schools, I take a focus on the politics of energy. At another school, I take a focus on the business case for energy. And then I have a course when I was teaching at Arizona State. It was primarily on, in the School of Sustainability, it was focusing on the sustainability of energy.
John, in the interest of having many questions and many answers from yourself, Tom Huizinga wanted to ask a question thereafter, Santosh. Tom?
Yeah, hi, John. Thanks very much for the perspective you are giving there, from especially from your US standpoint. If you look to all those climate change related damages in the US, in California, the fires, Texas, Louisiana, of course, by all those hurricanes, which most people would also be ascribed to climate change. What would you do to advocate to accelerate greenhouse gas reductions? What could we, as Shell alumni, maybe on small scale, but maybe also on a larger scale, do to accelerate this feeling? Do you understand my question?
Yes, I do. I think that what has been said by the oil and gas industry, really from even my time back when I was country chair, Shell was heavily involved, along with ConocoPhillips, along with BP, in 2005, 6, 7, in developing a cap and trade price on carbon system. And so I think from a Shell standpoint, and Shell has advocated price on carbon for more than 20 years. It goes back to when Shell helped design the cap and trade system for Europe, back around what, Matthias, was that sometime in the 2000 period, I think, where cap and trade became part of the European system. And so Shell was one of the authors of one of the early participants in that process, along with BP and Total, et cetera. And of course, the European Union. So I think from what could Shell alumni do? I think talking up the importance of a price on carbon is, to me, the most realistic, because without that price on carbon, I don't know about the European system or other governments around the world, but the US is such a lobbyist-oriented system that, whoever speaks last and writes the largest check to certain politicians for their campaigns, they prevail. And because the energy industry is so adversarial towards one another in the US. I mean, what I learned in my Washington experiences as country chair was that coal fights gas, gas fights coal, nuclear fights everybody, wind and solar fights everybody, biofuels fights oil and gas. It's just a constant battleground in state capitals and in the nation's capital. And until we get some consensus on price on carbon, it's going to be just a continued, you know, war with one another. And I mean,
Well, of course, you're right that we have this cap and trade system, well, ETS, I think it's called, and we are now at, I think, 25, maybe $27 per ton CO2, but that's not changing people's behavior. So, and I must say, in my old days, I did calculations on this, and then we see a big change when you reach $150, $200 per ton CO2. So,
yeah.
if that's not happening, yeah, you will see that this driver is apparently not sufficient to enforce accelerated change. So what could we do different?
Well, then I think it's more of the you know, using the regulatory system
Regulars, okay.
to make certain products more expensive by fiat, by mandate, and other products less expensive, so that you basically are steering the market. And I think that regulation of licensing, you know, let's be clear today. The best deal in the world for producing oil is the United States, because the royalties to government are so low. If you compare royalties in the U.S. to royalties in the North Sea, it's a world of difference.
No.
And so there has been a huge effort by many oil companies to maintain a very, what they call a fair and efficient royalty system, which means cheap, keep it cheap. But by raising the royalties, which raises ultimately the price of the product to the consumer, which then allows others. For example, I've been involved in a project to try to get natural gas turned into liquid fuel. I've spent time with a group called Fuel Freedom Foundation over the last decade, not a lot of time, but time, to figure out how to get a public policy intervention to get natural gas approved for methanol and ethanol production. And we have the technology that can do it. And then use natural gas, liquefied, just turn methane into liquid ethanol and use that as in addition to biofuel to reduce dependence on foreign oil. In the U.S. still imports 5 to 7 million barrels a day of imported oil into the country, despite the shale revolution. And trying to get the regulators to put the price up on product to warrant the economics of turning natural gas into liquid fuel has been very problematic. And so it's all about price, I think, Tom.
Okay, thanks.
Good price.
Thanks a lot. And let's listen to Santosh's question.
Hi, John. Thanks for sharing your experience for Shell. When you retired from Shell in 2008, I was in Houston. And at that time, you wrote a letter to all the staff. And I liked your closing paragraph. With your permission, can I read a couple of sentences and then ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. Let me quote that. Many people have asked me if I have any regrets about leaving Shell. My response, just one. And there is nothing I can do about it. Were I younger, I happily would ride the waves of change for Shell in the decades ahead, unquote. Do you still have the same regrets after 12 years? Or you have found anything more challenging opportunities than Shell? Thank you.
Thank you. That brings back some old memories, Santosh. Thank you. I meant it then, and I would say that I'm still riding the waves of change. I'm still, you know, I've been on a number of news programs in the last 6 months on the future of gasoline prices. Let's put it that way. What's the future of gasoline prices under a Trump administration or under a Biden administration? And what happens if the Biden administration bans fracking, which is a big political issue in the U.S. today? Do we or don't we continue fracking? And much of the world doesn't understand fracking, but the geological structures in the US lend themselves to this whole process of fracking and horizontal drilling. And in fact, I read recently that the biggest frack job so far is now at 7 miles. Can you imagine a 7-mile pipe on a horizontal basis, and the fracking of that formation in order to access the oil and natural gas? So I'd say the waves of change are still out there. I think the industry is incredible at finding new and different and ways of obtaining energy, at the same time trying to maintain its license to operate with its environmental fitness. Exxon and Chevron have come round on the environmental journey. They joined last December of 2019, or maybe it was 2018. They joined the oil and gas climate coalition, which was a very big deal, which added legitimacy to it. And for Chevron and Exxon to get into the climate battle on the side of, making the industry accountable, it's a very big thing. I think we still have a ways to go. There's so much more to do, and to do it more rapidly, as Tom points out. But I would say that we're still riding the waves of change.
Beautiful way to bring this letter back, Santosh. Thank you so much. And Charlie, over to you then.
Thank you, Dagmar. John, from your extensive experience on not-for-profit and for-profit boards, what would you say is the one theme consistently you've taken from your Shell experience into your board positions? And the reason I ask that is I'm on one board now, and I'm working towards my ICD certification over the next year, and hoping to join further boards. And I'd love to know, Matthias a few weeks ago shared his themes he's taken from his Shell experiences into his boards. And I wonder what is the one defining theme that you consistently apply in your board positions?
I'd name two, Charlie. And one is, I think that basic reliance on values. What are the core values that the board that you're on are trying to instill or maintain or grow in your organization? Because to me, the real purpose of organizations is to express their values in meaningful ways. So that's one. The second is reputation. Shell really focuses on, I don't know about today, I'm sure it does, but when I was there and we had the reserves recategorization problem, boy, did everybody get a lesson on reputation. It was, to go into a meeting of analysts and say, oh, now we're going to hear from the company that can't count. It was not a good time. And when Jeroen met with Shell Alumni, he made reference to the recategorization issues. And that was a hard time, but it brought home the significant importance of reputation. And when BP had the Macondo incident, I talked with, at the time, the CEO of, not Tony Hayward, but his successor as CEO at BP about reputation.
Oh, Bob Dudley, yeah.
Bob Dudley, yeah. Bob was a great choice to succeed Tony. And so reputation, and so whatever board you're on, whatever organization it may be, helping everyone understand the critical importance of reputation and how you can spend every day working on it, and you can lose it all in a day on it with a bad event, a bad scene, like a financial scandal or whatever it may be. Those would be the two things I bring from Shell.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Niels, over to you.
John, Niels here. Fondly remember the time from 2000 to 2005 when you were there as well in the US. My question is really all about, and sorry, I should add to that, thank you very much for that wonderful story that you shared with us. I really appreciate that. That was very insightful, very helpful for us. The question I have is a fairly obvious one. It's about the US approach towards the energy gap that we all can see until we get to fully renewable. The question I have is, what are the chances of nuclear energy getting back on the boards? And the second question, the by question, is how quickly do you believe that hydrogen as an energy source will actually come up as well and take its own position?
Interesting question. And I think one of my public speaking comments that I say in multiple venues is, what's the end game for energy? And when all is said and done and everybody's argued this and that and the other, and we've all made our commitments to, reform the energy system and fix the environment and get back to pre-industrial atmospheric levels of CO2, I say we're going to be living, maybe it'll be in 21st, maybe it'll be in 2100, maybe it'll be before then, maybe it'll be after then, but we'll have three basic sources of energy, and let's be blunt and call them what they are: nuclear, solar, and hydrogen. And then I pause. Nuclear, solar, and hydrogen. And immediately people say, what about oil? What about gas? What about coal? And it's not to say that there wouldn't be some, but to think about it today, 80% of the global energy comes from three fossil sources. What if 80% of energy in 50 years or 70 years, because of the transition that we make, comes from those three? And yes, we still need minerals and excavation and mining to get the uranium and to get the materials that we need for the wind and the solar that would make the green hydrogen, and all of the component parts of the solar panels. There might be some wind farms. I think we're going to exhaust ourselves on wind at some point because of the land use issues of wind. I think
Agreed.
it's just too much land to cover, and land becomes too important for other purposes. And so, if the end game is wind, is solar, hydrogen, and nuclear, what's happening in the U.S. right now with nuclear is a real pitched battle between the environmentalists who are against it, and they're mainly against it because of the nuclear waste issue, which has been unresolved for 70 years in this country, and what to do about nuclear waste. But now we have some very bright people getting into a modified, new, different form of nuclear called small modular reactors, and various and sundry technologies and sizes and designs and so forth. One of the people that's really getting behind it is Bill Gates.
Wow.
And Bill Gates is viewed probably as positively in this country as any person in the nation because of his philanthropic commitment and his public commitment to spend much of his fortune on philanthropy and to get others, billionaires, signed up for the same thing. So I think that the advances on nuclear will probably take another 10 to 20 years to really get going, which I regret that it would take that long, because we actually have in the US a storage center for Obama. It's a place called Yucca Mountain. And it was designed to be an all-time repository for national nuclear waste, buried 5 miles under the earth, but above the water table. And you know, it was developed over $20 billion in over 20 years. And it's just sitting there empty because Obama did a political deal with the majority leader of the Senate at the time in 2008 to support him for president versus Hillary Clinton. And he promised to shut down Yucca Mountain if he got his support, a guy named Harry Reid. And so for political reasons, Yucca Mountain has been shut, and Trump didn't want to reopen it in the first term, worrying it would hurt his chances for a second term. But I think if Trump gets a second term, we'll probably see Yucca Mountain back in business. That's a step towards advancing nuclear, at least in the US. But what China's doing with nuclear, what India is doing with nuclear, I think it'll be lessons for the world.
Thank you. Very insightful. Thanks, John.
Very clear messages. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question?
Dagmar, it's Matthias.
Yes, go ahead.
I've no question. Hi, John.
Hi,
Great comments. I really enjoyed it. What I just wanted to add to your point on nuclear is that fusion is actually making progress. There was a joke, some years ago. How long does it take to, every year it's another 5 years until you get fusion going. Now, there are a number of companies, they're smaller companies, well, small is all relative. I mean, they're spending a lot of money, but they are now moving towards demonstration projects to commercially produce energy from using fusion. And I think that is very exciting. And of course, fusion has no waste. And I think it is possible by 2025, we see actually that positive energy is being created through the fusion process. And it's possible that by 2030 or thereabouts, we'll have the first fusion reactor that is actually producing electricity to be sold into the grid. So there's currently, it's actually a bit of it's an interesting thing because it has a political overture as well, because as you can imagine, whatever nation basically gets hold of that technology will have a huge advantage. So there's a big political issue between China, the US, Europe, Canada is actually involved in this as well. So that's quite an exciting field to be watched as well. So I don't think it's just the modular ones which you mentioned. They're certainly a great opportunity, but I think, and they probably sort of fill a gap before we go towards fusion. And that's quite exciting space to watch.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thank you.
And it sounds like we need to kind of look into that topic as well and make sure we are all educated enough, Matthias. So if you have some ideas who is in that space and maybe also has a Shell background, then please bring us in touch, because this is very interesting just to really make sure we have, educate ourselves on those new trends. If there are no other burning questions, I think I probably wrap it up. And I have two things. One, first of all, a very big thank you to you, John. I would like to quote yourself. You said eventually that somebody senior up in the Shell organization once said the challenge of senior people is to become that passenger on the back of the bus again. And I'm so glad you didn't. So please keep, thinking and writing those waves of change, and, putting some fresh sparks into our heads and some of the good old stuff as well. Of course, there's always some critical new things that we will also put into your head. So it's a dynamic world. And I think it's exactly the type of dialogue that is needed to make sense and make meaning and move us all forward. So many thanks for your, engagement at all times. And then, I guess, secondly, I just would like to ask you all for those 3 minutes that will be left to just take a moment to think about a few of the people in the US space that you'd like to invite into Shell Alumni, and send them, a nice message, invite them in, because really it is important that we are not acting here as a kind of European-centric organization. We would like that engagement, and it takes many more voices than John alone to connect us the way we would like to be. But thanks to you, had definitely helped us a great deal to step up here. Thanks, John. And everyone else, have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
Dagmar.
everybody.
Thanks,
Good night,
Bye.
Niels. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.